Hey, my name's Bex from the Tiny Fibre Studio podcast, and in this video I want to show you a little bit of the maintenance that I do on my Schacht Matchless spinning wheel. First things first, there are certain things that you need to do every few hours while you spin, and in this case that means oiling the bearings and the sort of moving parts of the spinning wheel. So I'm going to show you exactly where Schacht recommends you do that. In terms of tools and supplies, I've got some paper towels, some of, this is actually Schacht's own oil that they recommend, and I've also been recommended some lithium grease as well. So I'll show you where I use the lithium grease and where Schacht recommends that you use oil. This is the proper Schacht oil bottle, and really the main reason that I have this is just because it has this really good thin needle point tip, which means that for some places where it's a little bit tricky to get the oil in, it's actually really useful. I found it really easy to make sure that the oil gets into the right places and doesn't accidentally drip onto anything else. You can also just use motor oil. I think they recommend 20 or 30 weight motor oil. But as I say, the bottle for me was really useful to have. So let's make a start. The main thing that you need to make sure you oil on a really regular basis is the flyer. So I'm going to take the flyer off and I will show you where we oil on that. I have this one set up in double drive at the moment. So I'm going to take everything off the flyer, the whirl and the bobbin, so that we're just left with the flyer itself. So the first thing you want to make sure you do is, if you can, and particularly in between bobbins, just clean off any of the excess oil that's still left over from the previous time that you oiled it. That just means that any dirt or debris or fibre that's got stuck doesn't just get more oil poured on top of it, because you'll end up with bits of, grit and stuff that could damage the metal over time. So you want to make sure that's all nice and clean, and also the other end of the flyer as well. Just make sure that there's no fibres still stuck to it. There we go, so that's nice and clean. So the bits that Schacht recommends you oil are here, 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 and on the ends over here. Again, check with the instructions for your wheel, because some of them don't require oiling in all of those places. Double check your manual. So all I would do is just put a drop of oil on here, drop of oil here, drop of oil here, and one on the end. The reason that it's recommended you put them in those locations is because when you put the bobbin on, you'll see that it kind of makes contact with where we oiled down here, where we oiled on the other end of the bobbin, and then when you put it back into situ, the rear bearing sits in there and the front sits in there. So all of the points where metal is making contact with metal are oiled, and also any points where the metal is making contact with the bobbin, those are also oiled. Now, some people, including myself, prefer to use lithium grease on certain parts of the wheel, and I do use this on the flyer bearings, so where the flyer touches the bobbins. That's where I use the lithium grease, and that's only because I tend to feel like it kind of sticks around a little bit longer and it's less likely to get kind of moved up and down the shaft as you take the bobbin on and off. So I literally just use a tiny bit of this white lithium grease on those bearing points that we just mentioned. A little tiny bit. It lasts for ages. I've had this pot for probably about 3 years. There's barely a dent in it. So I recommend it. It's not what Schacht recommends in their user manual, but lots of people on the Ravelry group use it without any particular issues. And like I say, I just feel that when I put that on there, it's just it kind of spreads itself around nice and evenly, and never had any issues. There are a couple of other places that Schacht recommends you oil, and They recommend that you do the drive wheel bearings fairly frequently, but the crank bearings a little bit less frequently. This is where having a needle-nosed oil bottle comes in really, really handy, because frankly without this you're going to find it quite difficult to get to the points that you need to oil. For the drive wheel bearing, you just want to go in just next to it, little squeeze, and that'll give you a drop of oil in there. And then the back one is a little bit more difficult to get into, but I can usually, if I go in this way, I can usually get right into that bearing. If any oil drips into bits that you weren't intending to oil, just make sure that you wipe it off quickly with a cloth. And then on the rear of the wheel, you've got the crank bearings as well. So again, Schacht do recommend that you oil these a little bit less frequently. Again, check your user manual for your particular wheel, but I just kind of go a little bit in here. And there you go, that is the regular maintenance that you need to do to your wheel.